Well, I guess it would help. I went to the right spot. Okay. So Mark 15 isn't huge like Mark 14 was, but there's still a lot to cover tonight. So let's once again start with some outlines. So I want to share the same outlines from the mid 20th century scholar and the early 20th century scholar, from which I gave you the outlines to Mark 14, but I'm going to give you a different style from a more modern work as well. But the first outline comes from the middle of the 20th century, Frederick Grant in the Interpreter's Bible. And he just makes it a simple 6 point breakdown of this day of the crucifixion, with 15, 1 to 5 being Jesus before Pilate. But as we're going to see, it's actually more than that even. And 6 through 15, Jesus being condemned to death. Um, the mocking that takes place, which could be known as the quote carnival of the king. Um, the crucifixion, with a few problems that may have been bugging people or might be still bugging your students. Jesus' actual death on the cross, and the courageous faith of Joseph of Arimathea. In the early 20th century, Ezra Gould in the International Critical Commentary actually got it down to 4 parts. Jesus before Pilate, 15, 1 to 15, because after all, the initial interrogation led to the death sentence. Jesus mocked by the Roman soldiers, essentially the same carnival of the king, the crucifixion taking place from 21 to 41, and the deposition from the cross and the burial of Jesus in 42 through 47. Now, the third is completely different. This one, from the Common English Bible Study Bible, is built around the clock. You can see the little clock in the background there. So for our convenience, I've gone ahead and I've changed references like morning and third hour and sixth hour and preparation into our culture's equivalent. So this idea comes from the CEB Study Bible. So the first part is verses 1 to 24, which is from daybreak to just before 9 a.m. And that's the council and the aftermath. And then there's the third hour, which is really 9 a.m. And that's when the crucifixion proper begins. We'll call that verses 25 to 32. And then in the sixth hour, which is noon, that's when we have the darkness and the death taking place from 33 to 41. And then, of course, there is the preparation, which is the pre-sunset hours, where we have the deposition and the burial from 42 to 47. So that kind of gives us 3 different structures to build on if we kind of want to be able to hang our information on a skeleton. And immediately in the morning, the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes, all of the Sanhedrin, held a consultation and bound Jesus, carried him away, and handed him into Pilate's custody. Now, you notice Mark's favorite adverb here, immediately. And what that should probably tell us is that the leaders in the Sanhedrin were feeling a sense of urgency about moving forward to solve the Jesus problem. Now, some translations have them holding a council. Some have them hammering out a plan. Uh, but really, what we have here is a consultation. They've really already made the decision during the night. But the problem is that a formal procedure where one is put on trial was supposed to take place in the light of day. And a sentence, a judgment, was supposed to take place on the second day. Now, an informal hearing could occur at night, but the sentence could only be pronounced in a daylight hearing. But the irony here is that it seems like they're hurrying up and holding a consultation in order to ratify the decision that they made in the wee hours, in the dark hours of the night. But now that it's day, they're trying to ratify. But it would still be an illegal action because it was still the same day where they had started the deliberation, because the day starts at sunset, what we would call the day before. And so, this is truly, an irregular procedure. And there's something else strange about this verse. You remember last session when we showed the image, the diagram of the Sanhedrin, and we explained how that the chief priest, the presider, is number one, and that in two, the number two is that semicircle, that horseshoe, if you will. What we had were more of the chief priests and their families, the elders, those who were very much respected in the community, had a certain amount of wealth and weight to throw around, and the scribes. Well, right here, the verse talks about the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes, and then it says all of the Sanhedrin. After listing the specific three elements of the Sanhedrin, then it reiterates the whole council. Well, one thing that might suggest is that there might have been the lack of a quorum the night before. And it's probably just Mark's way of indicating that not just a few of the Jewish leaders, but a critical mass of them were culpable in sending Jesus to his death. Well, I like the way Edward Schweitzer put it, quote, "The sentence was not passed by a few men whose circumstances were responsible for their error, nor was it a momentary surge of hate which delivered Jesus over to death on the cross. It was the result of a considered decision," end quote. Now, also interesting, I think, is that this is the first time in Mark's account of the Passion that it mentions Jesus being bound. Now, John 18:12 has him bound when he's arrested out in the garden. And John 18:24 has Annas, the co-high priest, having him bound over before giving him into the custody of Caiaphas, the other high priest. And now he's bound before being handed over into the custody of Pilate. In fact, does the term bound and carried away even indicate that they were so worried that he might escape or that somehow the crowd might encroach and cause enough chaos that he could escape, that maybe they have bound him hand and foot so that he couldn't even walk. They were carrying him uh, over to be questioned by Pilate. So, does this mean he was unbound when he was questioned and only bound for that first century equivalent of a prisoner's perp walk? You know, the perp walk when you see the person being arrested going in for their arraignment, and sometimes they don't want their picture taken, and they let them put a coat over their head or something so that they aren't ashamed. Well, it sort of sounds like this might be the first century equivalent of that. And it sounds like uh, they were both afraid that he might escape with the crowd's intervention, but also they wanted to humiliate him. And if they wanted to humiliate him, it sounds kind of like an echo of Isaiah 53:8, with that idea of him being led away, especially when you combine it with the word for being handed into custody. And then finally, I've added a picture to this slide, a photograph I took in Caesarea Maritima, and I have put the emphasis here. You can see where a lot of the letters have been defaced, but you still have the us from Pontus and Pilatus, which you would probably recognize as the Latin for Pilate. And later on in that inscription, it calls him a prefect. Now, this stone here is right next to where Herod's palace was in Caesarea Maritima, but it's not the original stone. And the reason it's not the original stone is because the original stone is in the custody of the Jewish Antiquities Department to make sure that it doesn't erode anymore. But this was discovered late in the 20th century. And before that, a lot of historical skeptics had said, oh, come on, Pilate was never a prefect. Oh, but here we have this first century inscription. The inscription was actually in honor of Herod, not Herod. Yeah, it was in honor of Tiberius, excuse me, in honor of Tiberius. And he, basically it's a first century artifact, and it's proof positive that Pilate was a prefect. So, those people who question the history of the Bible, that they're setting themselves up to be embarrassed, is all I can say. And prefect and procurator were often used in the provinces interchangeably to refer to their governors, although the term prefect has a tendency to be more of a military governor. And we know from the way that Pilate's uh, regime started out that a military governor is exactly what he should be. Now, in order to understand the way that Pilate operated in the trial, you have to know a little bit more about Pilate himself. Because a lot of people look at the biblical account and they see him as wishy washy. They see him as milk toast. They see him as weak. And they try to reconcile that with the secular accounts that talk about him as a bloodthirsty, ruthless, military governor. So let me explain a little bit of how that works. Now, Pilate had a patron in Caesar Tiberius's court. Here's a bust of that patron. His name was Lucius Aelius Sejanus, or as we anglicize it, Sejanus. Sejanus was very, very, very anti Semitic. He hated the Jews, and his policies were reflected in two military actions that Pilate made as soon as he arrived in Jerusalem as governor. Because first, he had brought ensigns with Caesar's image on them into Jerusalem. And of course, that was against Jewish law to display any sort of images in God's city. So the population was incensed. And they sent some of the leaders from the Sanhedrin to Pilate, and they begged him to remove those images and take them back to Caesarea Maritima, where they had started. But Pilate doubled down and refused. So they protested by lying prostrate right there in Jerusalem in front of Pilate for 5 days and 5 nights. And Pilate decided that this was counterproductive. He decided that this was interfering with his enforcement of Roman law in Jerusalem. So he told them that if they didn't quit protesting, that his soldiers had permission to bear their swords and cut them to ribbons. But he was quite surprised that the Jews simply bared their necks, laid back down, and said to go ahead. So Pilate tacoed. He walked back his threat, and he actually had the ensigns returned to Caesarea rather than have to slaughter all of those. Now, that may not sound hardline, but he must have decided that you can't negotiate with fanatics, because he confiscated the Corban offering, which we studied earlier, but he confiscated the Corban offering out of the temple treasury. Quite a bit of it. He had a good purpose in it. He saved lives with it because he built an aqueduct with that Corban money that went 400 furlongs, which amounts to, as I understand it, 50 miles. So he was bringing water from 50 miles away to Jerusalem with the money that he had confiscated from the temple. But the Jews began to protest loudly and to interfere with everything that was going on in the streets and even close to the Praetorium, where Pontius Pilate stayed. So when the Jews began to protest, Pontius Pilate decided, I don't want to be too obvious about this. So he had his men get in their armor and put peasant clothes, peasant cloaks and garments on top of their armor. And instead of their swords, they were to take staves, the big sticks like peasants would. And then disguised as peasants, they went through the streets and the courts and the temple, and the soldiers would just beat every protester so that a lot of them would die. Well, they ended up dying from the wounds for being beaten, and a lot of them died from being crushed in the panic of trying to get out of there. And so that's that's exactly the kind of guy that Pilate was, and I'm sure he sent correspondence to Sejanus saying, "Look what we did. Look how in command of the situation I am," but that he wanted plausible deniability in case Tiberius said, "What's going on? Are you trying to create unrest? Are you trying to create an insurrection. Well, by the time of Jesus's trial, Pilate was on very thin ice because his patron Sejanus had secretly usurped a lot of Tiberius's authority and put his crony in charge of military cohorts of the Roman legions and auxiliaries all round about Rome, because his intent was that he would mount a coup against Tiberius and make himself the emperor. Now, he didn't just do that, he had already assassinated the chosen successor of Tiberius, Germanicus. And he had already bribed another leader in Syria to assassinate him by poisoning Germanicus. So when Tiberius finally got the information of what Sejanus was up to, Tiberius out covert actioned Sejanus in that he sent his messengers to pay a larger bribe to all of the cronies and to keep Sejanus from moving forward with his plan. He kept promising Sejanus all sorts of honors and monetary rewards and all sorts of triumphs to come. So then, when Tiberius actually got around to making his move, he sent a lengthy proclamation to be read in the Senate in Sejanus's presence. Sejanus thought he was going to be honored, but the last paragraph of the proclamation declared Sejanus to be a traitor. And the Praetorian Guard immediately removed him from the Senate. The scene here is from a movie, but they immediately removed him from the Senate and executed him on the same day. Now, when Sejanus's anti-Semitic influence was no longer at court, the emperor began to gravitate to being more favorably disposed toward the Jews. So Pilate, not wanting to be seen as having been unduly influenced by Sejanus's early patronage, certainly didn't want any trouble in the middle of this major pilgrim feast in Jerusalem. So just in case you were questioning his weakness compared to the secular accounts of how ruthless he was, that may offer some perspective as to why he was much more careful. Of course, it doesn't offer an excuse. As Ralph Martin wrote, Pilate had no choice but to pass sentence on Jesus. No choice, that is, provided he was prepared to put prestige, rank, and security before the dictates of conscience, duty, and truth. Yes, no choice, as long as you were willing to sell out. Now, I also think it's interesting that in Mark's passion narrative, from the end of chapter 14, through the end of chapter 15, Jesus only speaks 3 times in Mark's passion narrative. Now, I know in other gospels he speaks more, but Mark is speaking to Christians in the first century undergoing persecution. And he wants them to see that Jesus, the Son of God incarnate, faced the same kinds of persecution and that he didn't waver, that he stood stoically and courageously. And also, maybe maybe it's referring to the suffering servant psalm in Isaiah, where it's saying he opened not his mouth, because there's a lot of places in Mark's passion narrative where Jesus could have defended himself and he doesn't. So Pilate begins the interrogation which had said he claims to be king of the Jews. Here's a man who wants to be a rival for Caesar. Here's somebody who wants to overthrow the government. And so Pilate asked him, and I like the emphasis in the Greek, are you the king of the Jews? But Jesus answered him, that's what you're saying. You're saying so. It's really a non answer. He's saying, it's not my claim. You're making the claim on behalf of those Jewish leaders that have accused me. So you say, and, it's kind of like, prove it. It's kind of like, bring the receipts. So Pilate, is kind of dumbfounded here, as a matter of fact. So what happens here in verse 3 is that it says the chief priests keep on accusing Jesus much. Now I know a lot of translations say they were accusing him of many things, but literally in the Greek, that's what it says. They were accusing him much. And with that, the old idea that if you lack evidence, you shout louder. Well, they lacked evidence, so they're shouting louder to try to get the attention and to create all sorts of havoc. So again, Pilate asked him a question, saying, "Don't you have any answers? You know, look at how much they're accusing you. Look at how powerfully they're trying to bring a case against you. What have you got to say, Jesus?" In verse 4 and in verse 5. But Jesus didn't answer anything. Therefore, Pilate was amazed. Now, it kind of goes along with prophecy and the idea that people were going to be amazed when the suffering servant was struck dumb and didn't answer, or acted dumb and didn't answer anything. So once again, what we have is a tie to the suffering servant song in Isaiah, in the last part of 52 and the first part of 53. So then Pilate is stuck between a rock and a hard place. I've already said his patron is gone. He can't look too anti Semitic. And if he doesn't give in to the crowd, we're going to have the big mess here of him getting called back to Rome. And he can't have that, especially without his patron there. So at the feast, uh, he used to um, release someone. So some people call this the Paschal, as in Passover amnesty, and some of them use the Latin term, the privilegium paschal, which means the Passover privilege. And there are a lot of skeptics who just don't buy into this idea of the releasing, because they say we don't have any Roman records, we don't have any secular records that show this, and the Jews don't even talk about this per se. However, we do know now. Admittedly, this is not first century, but in the fifth century, we do know in 444 that at the feast of the Passover, the governor did release someone to the crowd, and he said, for the Passover. And we do know that there is a Mishnah reference, and that the Mishnah reference said that at the Passover there could be a release. So those people who are skeptical, once again, are probably too cynical, too skeptical, because we have two accounts, the Mishnaic account and the 5th century account, that indicates that this took place. Now, it may not have taken place every year. It may not have taken place on a regular basis, but it was a possibility. It was allowed. And of course, it was allowed here. And of course, we have the famous substitution of Barabbas. Pilate picks the absolute worst murderer, rebel, revolutionary he could, so that he can frame the choice very beautifully for the crowd and give them a chance to let Jesus off. But of course, the crowd doesn't do that because the Jewish leaders are there in the midst of everything, getting them to say, give us Barabbas, give us Barabbas. So the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he said, who do you want me to release? And they cried out for Barabbas. And Pilate then said, so what do I do with this man that you call the King of the Jews? And they cried out again and said, crucify him. And again, Pilate, it doesn't say he's amazed, but it does say, why? What has he done? And yet the crowd kept crying out. And in order to satisfy them, he's willing to do that. So he gives in. We don't have the account of the dream or the hand washing here, but we do have this happening. So the soldiers lead him away in verse 16. As we move into the next part, they lead him away into the Temple Antonius. The Temple Antonius is the praetorium. It is the garrison. It is the security checkpoint, if you will, at the temple proper, right next to the temple wall. And so it isn't too far a trek to lead him over there. So Jesus is coming into their house, and he's coming into to here where they are. And what we really have here is what is known as the Carnival of the King. Which I seem to have misplaced. Oh, there it is. Prisoners were dressed in royal robes and greeted as though they were Caesar, saying, Ave Caesar, hail Caesar. Actually, in classical Latin, that'd be Ave Caesar. And now it becomes, hail, King of the Jews. So they're mocking him using a familiar ceremony with which they mock other pretenders and rebels, who've gone against Caesar. But it's a little different. When they were mocking the other prisoners, they would put a laurel crown on them, representing the laurel crown that Caesar often wore. But in this case, to inflict maximum pain, they mock the laurel crown with the crown of thorns, a caricature of the emperor's crown. And the soldiers press it down on Jesus' head so that they can make sure that it bleeds. And yet, Christians have always seen this as a token of the rightful crown of Jesus, as in the hymn that goes, "The head that once was crowned with thorns is crowned with glory now." I didn't get that typed into my manuscript, but it'll be in the notes when I upload them. Now, before I get to the main point, speaking of the Carnival of the King, I need to touch on something that the skeptics say. The skeptics point to the fact that the Gospel of Luke doesn't have this account, and that the Gospel of John places it earlier in his passion narrative. And they question whether the soldiers would really have bothered to engage in such an extraneous mock trial. After all, the soldiers didn't have any kind of a vested interest in challenging Jesus as King of the Jews. But they've overlooked the actual historical parallels. Because in the same era, King Agrippa went to Egypt. And there, since the crowd that hated him couldn't get hold of him, they grabbed a mentally retarded man. They robed him up, they put a crown on his head, and they gave him a scepter. Now, that wasn't the Roman soldiers, it was the Egyptian crowd. But the Roman soldiers, if you need an example of Roman soldiers, are reputed to have grabbed the unpopular Emperor Vitellius and given him the same kind of mockery and torture that's recorded here, except after his mock trial, they lynched him. They hung him. Apparently, they were very angry about the way they'd been treated under Vitellius and the conditions under which they were living. So they mocked his royalty and they killed him. Now, with Jesus, these soldiers had been garrisoning Judea for a while, and they were accustomed to dealing with the unruly mobs of Jewish zealots and the like. So they knew about troublemakers who had a nationalistic agenda, and so they assumed that Jesus was a nationalist with a nationalist agenda and that he was going to make their job tougher so they could get some revenge on him while having some sadistic fun as well. Because that's the way undisciplined, out of control soldiers tend to get. And that's what was happening here. So there's a bust of Vitellius, in case you were wondering about my historical account. So why do we have this account in the Bible? Why is it important? Why is Jesus blindfolded and beaten with cheap shots by Roman soldiers? Why do we cringe at those long thorns twisted into a crowd and pressed onto his head? I mean, he is already weak from blood loss, because out in the Garden of Gethsemane, it said he sweat drops as of blood, which certainly suggests hemohydrosis. And then we hear these earthy men mocking Jesus concerning a kingdom they don't understand. So what are we seeing? What we're really seeing is the typical reaction of humanity when they feel threatened by God's claim upon their lives. So they either push back with anger and violence, or they just deny the claim with a cynical disdain for God's people and a blasphemous mockery of God. But either way, their actions are telling God to not get in their way at the same time that God is really working for their best interest. The Roman soldiers don't want to have to deal with another rebellion. And the irony is, less than 30 years from now, they were going to have to. And they don't want to deal with a rival authority for Rome's power. And today, those people who fight against God and mock God are afraid of having to deal with a rival authority to science, a rival authority to subjective anything goes morality, a rival authority to anything to get ahead business, and a rival authority to the great God called tolerance. And anytime that we have to go against those modern gods, it means making tough decisions and undergoing tough times. And spoiled, pampered moderns don't want to have their personal wills confronted by tough decisions and tough times. We want it easy. And I really believe that's why the Bible presents such a gruesome scene. But that's not the only part of the account that I wonder about. I wonder about the reference to Simon, traditionally known as Black Simon. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. Alexander and Rufus? Is it possible that his sons are going to be Paul's valued companions later? Maybe so. Anyway, they are significant. So, whatever was going on here, as they compel Simon to carry his cross, it was kind of weird. Plautus, the Roman historian, tells us that the criminal was always required to carry his own patibulum. And here's Jesus carrying his patibulum. They didn't carry the whole cross. The vertical pieces were often, right there at the crucifixion site. But they carried the patibulum, and the patibulum was good enough because the patibulum usually weighed about 70 pounds. Now, basically, on a weight machine, I'll do 10, maybe 20 reps at 70 pounds. But then my arms are hurting and I'm done, and I'm not weak from loss of blood. I'm not about to fall down. I haven't been whipped. I haven't been beaten. If he had had to carry the vertical piece together, it would have been 300 pounds. So, when you see those beautiful paintings of Jesus carrying the whole cross, it's great symbolically, but it's not realistically. So, because Jesus didn't carry his own patibulum, There are a lot of skeptics who try to cast doubt on the entire crucifixion scene because of this anomaly. But remember, Jesus had already lost blood due to the hemihydrosis and to the blood from the scalp due to the thorny crown and from the back due to the scourging. So it's almost certain the crowd would have been most unsatisfied if Jesus had died prematurely and that main event would have had to be canceled. So the soldiers wanted to make sure this didn't happen. So to me, it seems reasonable, to accept this incident as being historical. Jesus was weak. They thought he was going to die on the way to Golgotha. So they conscripted somebody from out of town to do it. Now, of course, a lot of people read that Simon was from Cyrene, and they know that Cyrene was in North Africa. And so they immediately thought of him as a black skinned slave. And even the great poem on the crucifixion by James Weldon Johnson reads, "Up Golgotha's rugged road, I see my Jesus go. I see him sink beneath the load. I see my drooping Jesus sink. And then they laid hold on Simon, Black Simon, yes, Black Simon. They put the cross on Simon, and Simon bore the cross." Now, I suppose Simon could have been dark skinned, ebony skinned, but the truth is, Simon is actually a Jewish name, and it's very likely that he was in Jerusalem on a pilgrimage for Passover. And even if he wasn't a Jew, he probably wasn't as dark skinned as some have portrayed him, because Cyrene is at the very tip top of Libya, not necessarily the heart of the darker skinned races. So even though I think Simon plays an important role here, I don't think it matters whether he was a Jew, a dark skinned African, or a more Arabic looking Libyan. The fact is, he's pictured as bearing Jesus's cross. The same verb, iro, that's used here was used in Mark 8:34, where we are supposed to lift up and carry the cross, where we're supposed to be willing to suffer like unto Jesus. And here is this other man who is also carrying a cross and probably following Jesus as they're leading him to the place of crucifixion. I find that fascinating. And remember that immediately after Jesus had revealed himself as the Messiah and spoken about the necessity of his death, and Simon Peter challenged him, saying it wasn't necessary, that's when Jesus said in Mark 8:34 that anyone who wanted to be his disciple needed to disdain their idea of themselves, lift up their cross, and follow him. So here we have this outsider named Simon bearing Jesus's cross and following along behind him, symbolically doing what Jesus commanded for all of us to do. He's been derailed from his personal journey and forced to follow Jesus. But it certainly suggests that we need to do the same. We need to be certain that we're not following our own ideas and our own plans instead of opening ourselves up to the opportunity to follow him. And because we cannot tie down Simon's nationality for certain, it reminds us that anyone can become that self denying, Jesus following disciple of Mark 8:34. So, this brief mention of Simon, who may or may not be the father of the Rufus in Romans 16:13, is essentially a call to discipleship before we even get to the main event. Now, of course, the people are mocking him, and he doesn't respond. But the significant thing in Mark, oh, wow, I'm going to come back to this. Once again, I got to slide out of order. It'll be fixed before tomorrow night. Okay. But what about Jesus's cry of despair? A recent volume paints great word pictures on this. Quote, obviously, the dying Jesus cries out in blood-curdling horror at the apparent abandonment by Eli, Eli. That's from F. Scott Spencer in his book, Passions of the Christ. And as he notes in his book, the Markan path from Gethsemane to Golgotha just gets darker and starker. It leaves Jesus increasingly alone and abandoned. As first, he is stripped of his disciples who flee and deny him. And then he's stripped bare of his own clothing for the purpose of torture and later crucifixion. So when he says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, that's Aramaic for Eli, my God, Eli, my God, lama, why? Sabachthani, have you forsaken? Have you abandoned? Even Martin Luther was supposed to have been aghast, wondering how God could be forsaken by God. And Dorothy Sayers, the Christian mystery writer and friend of C.S. Lewis, described it as being as if God turned atheist. Well, we can't deny Jesus a very, very human desire to give up the cup of dying when he was in Gethsemane, even though his relationship with the Trinity was such that he already knew the answer and that he was already willing to submit to what was necessary. And so we can't deny Jesus that very real, very human pain. It must have felt like he was all alone. It must have felt like he was abandoned by the Trinity that he participated in. And indeed, to a certain extent, as he is taking sin upon him, that sin is blocking off the usual perfect relationship that he has with the Trinity. So the loss, the grief, the hurt, the pain must definitely have been there. But that's not all. Because after he says that, any good Jew would have realized, oh, yeah, that's the first verse of Psalm 22. And Psalm 22 is Jesus clearly in the Davidic tradition. His death is parallel to a whole lot of the prayers and songs that were written by or given to that famous king. But the character of his death is such that when he sings out, when he cries out, when he screams in horror, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? It's the first verse of a psalm that has many, many parallels because in 1524, they're gambling for his garments, just as it says they will in Psalm 22:18. In 1529, it talks about people mocking and wagging their heads, just as it does in Psalm 22:7. And in 1530 to 31, they cry out, "Save yourself," just as they do in 22:8. And in 1532, they're just reviling him, saying the foulest things they can, just as it says will happen in Psalm 22:6. And in 1534, it refers to a cry of dereliction, just like that cry in the first verse of the psalm that he's just done, that pain, expressing that idea of feeling separated because of the burden of sin on him, blocking his normal relationship with God. In 1536, they give him vinegar to drink, just as in Psalm 69:21, he gets vinegar to drink. Although the irony of that vinegar to drink is that it's a Roman soldier, not a Jew, who brings that vinegar to him to drink. And it's supposed to be an act of mercy. And actually, they even used it as part of their rehydration scheme, even though we know vinegar wouldn't be the perfect rehydrator. But anyway, that they actually used vinegar as a drink when they were on duty. In 1540, we have people watching from a distance, just as Psalm 38:11 says that we do so. So we have Jesus here clearly in the Davidic tradition. And 2/3 of Psalm 22 is about all of this anguish and suffering that King David, or the person writing it in favor of King David, is saying that he has. But guess what? In that last part of the psalm, we come to Psalm 22, 27, and 31, verses 27 and 31 of that psalm, where it says, "The whole earth from end to end will remember and come back to Yahweh. Men will proclaim the Lord to generations still to come, proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn." And in fact, the psalm ends with a word of triumph. All this he has done. Now, I know many of you have heard me talk about this before, but I don't believe God the Father turned his back on Jesus. I don't think that's the meaning of the Lord's cry. I think actually, when the Lord cried, Psalm 22:1, that he was telegraphing the triumph that was occurring even as he looked defeated. But since Jesus became sin for us, there was a separation. And like I said, that separation would have seemed like he had been forsaken. Just like when we have unconfessed sin in our lives and we feel like our prayers aren't going beyond the ceiling, they aren't. We have to get right with God by confessing our sins. But God and the Holy Spirit didn't have to turn their back on Jesus, because God the Son, who was on the cross, agreed with God the Father and God the Spirit before the creation of the world that his death would be necessary. Now, I don't know how in the miracle of the Trinity that took place, But the Bible's clear that it took place before creation. And even as Jesus became sin for us, he was still being totally obedient to the plan and true to his very nature. So I don't see any reason for the Trinity to be even out of temporary fellowship for a moment. And what we have is a screen or a curtain that's up temporarily. Well, anyway, I also look at the fact that the Bible describes Jesus as the perfect Lamb of God, the unblemished sacrifice. And I look at the Old Testament sacrificial system. Now, I don't see anywhere that God turns his back on the sacrifices in the sacrificial system until, as we'll see in a moment, the temple veil is torn in two at Jesus's death. Instead, there's every indication that the burnt sin offering of a repentant sinner was perceived as a sweet smelling savor to God. And if those offerings of stinky, bloody, gut filled smoke could smell good to God and be welcome in heaven, then I feel absolutely certain that the offering of the sinless Son of God was a sweet smelling savor to the Father. Now, there are some other details about the crucifixion that have given some folks some trouble. There was a professor at Oakton Community College who taught history and said that the crucifixion account in the Bible is impossible because Jesus was crucified between two thieves. And he said confidently that crucifixion was such an unusual punishment reserved for the most serious threats to an empire that there is no way that three people would have been crucified at once. But what the professor neglects to consider is the fact that the Romans didn't want anyone fomenting rebellion. And the Greek word that's used in the text for thieves can also mean rebel or revolutionary. And we know that because Josephus uses that word for rebel or revolutionary. So Pilate could have simply ordered that the whole group of suspected revolutionaries that he had in the garrison at the time be publicly executed in the most dramatic fashion. So I think that the professor protests too much, at least too much for the evidence, especially considering the fact that when Spartacus led the slave rebellion, we're told that over 100 crosses lined the road after that rebellion. And there are others who claim that it would have been preposterous for Pilate to have ordered the title King of the Jews to be placed on the cross. They automatically assumed that Pilate's intent was positive, perhaps deriving it from Pilate's refusal in another gospel to remove that titulum when the Jews are offended. And they think it's the Gospels giving a cheap affirmation of Jesus's position by Pilate. But most likely, considering the spot Pilate was in, it was Pilate offering a symbolic shot across the bow to anyone who wanted to claim autonomous authority from Rome. So unless it was one of Rome's puppet kings like the Herods, the idea of a king of the Jew is it's treasonous. You know, it's rebellion. It's a dangerous title. Of course, if the king of the Jews is dead at the hands of the Romans, what does that do? It emphasizes the legitimacy of Roman authority. So as I contemplate it, I don't really think Pilate was trying to be religious in his message. I believe he was sending a message, all right, just as I think he was sending a message by having an unusual number of rebels crucified at the same time. But let's get to the heart of the matter. I know there's a lot of details in some of the other gospels that you'd like to hear about. You'd like to hear about the repentant thief. Not here. You'd like to hear about the earthquake and the dead walking on the earth and ask me difficult questions about whether they had to die again or whether they were ghosts. And you'd like to hear some of the other so-called 7 last sayings of Christ because Jesus is so quiet in Mark's account of the crucifixion. But Mark didn't focus on those. Mark's focus is the fact that it grew dark in the middle of the day. And as Jesus's self-sacrifice was nearing conclusion, the natural light of the world was obscured by the death of the spiritual light of the world. The sequence is artistic. We hear Jesus cry, and then our attention is diverted to the temple area and to the most holy place where the separating curtain is torn by an unseen hand, as if to symbolize a breaking down of the barrier that kept men and women from God's presence. And that's the way Ralph Martin described it. Or another expression of this is it's tearing from top to bottom means God is loose in the world. That's the way Suzanne Henderson wrote it. That's pretty impressive. No barriers, no obstacles to God's presence. How ironic that moments after Jesus proclaimed, "Why have you forsaken me?" No one is forsaken because God's presence is available to those who will receive. Now, the veil of the temple was the dividing line between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies was originally where the priest would go in to sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat atop the Ark of the Covenant on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. So this sacred space represented the area on earth where God would acknowledge the forgiveness of sin. And now with Jesus' death, that sacred space was theoretically and symbolically open to everyone. God's forgiveness couldn't be kept within the sacrificial system. And isn't it interesting that Mark's gospel begins with the opening of the heavens? The heavens are split open in chapter 1 at Jesus' baptism. And God's voice affirms that Jesus is God's son. And Mark's gospel ends, or comes close to the end here, with the opening of sacred space where God forgives. Now, we also have right here tied close together, and that's why I put them on the same slide, is a Gentile, a non-Jew. I think it's interesting that on Jesus' death, a non-Jew, one of our Lord's executioners, observes the way the Lord died, and he cries out an affirmation that this was the Son of God. Now, technically, I know you've heard the Greek could be translated, surely this is the Son of a God. But the way this guy responds, the way he acted, the dramatic way it's portrayed, it almost has to be the affirmation we've always believed it was. Surely this is the Son of God. Now, the centurion may not have known entirely what he was saying. He may have been thinking just in terms of the unnatural and the weird events that had taken place on Jesus' death. He might have said that Jesus is out of the ordinary, like an emperor who was supposed to be a god. Or he might have been saying that Jesus was someone who should have been taken note of. But it doesn't really seem so. It seems like this has mesmerized this fellow and that he is certain. Now, there was also one more thing to be done: the deposition and the burial. Deposition, taking him down off the cross. Now, before they could deal with the body, and they needed to deal with the body before sunset because it had to be done before sunset, or you would violate the Sabbath, or it couldn't be done till after the Sabbath was over. So Joseph of Arimathea was a Judean. He was an active leader in Jerusalem. And by making this request for Jesus's body, it's risky in a lot of respects. First, Pilate might execute him, assuming that if he wants Jesus's body, he must be a collaborator. So he could get executed. Secondly, it's starting to get late. They've got to get this done before sunset. And Joseph, who seems to have been on the council, Joseph would end up violating Sabbath law if the sundown came too quickly. He could lose status on the council, or he could end up just being an overt enemy of the ones who had turned Jesus over to the Romans to begin with. So Joseph, in an act of faith, takes a tremendous risk and moves forward. And indeed, this risk was worthwhile, because as Son of God, Jesus' death, we can't say it enough, made possible our forgiveness of sin. But more than making the forgiveness of sin possible, it makes union with God, partnership with God, life with God possible. So Jesus, who came to earth, was God without boundaries, taking limits on himself in order to be with us. And his death destroyed the final boundary of death so that we can look towards a future without limits with him. To put it in almost science fiction terms, Jesus broke the multidimensional barrier and he opened his way to the X dimensions of timeless reality. Mark does a fabulous job of helping us see how that Jesus stood courageous and how that even in his darkest moments, Jesus pointed to the Father and to the victory ahead, which we will look at next week.